It's sleeping sickness, or a protist from the genus Trypanosomes. So, let's talk about protists. We've already studied plants, and we're going to be studying animals later, but what about this kingdom of protists? Now, protists are actually the most diverse eukaryotes, so we're going to talk about three main groups of protists today, and they're categorized by the way they eat, or their mode of nutrition. So the first one we're going to go through are our protozoa. These are the animal-like ones, and they ingest their food. Then we're going to talk about our algae, which are photosynthetic and they're kind of like plants. And finally, we're going to talk about our slime molds, which are absorptive and they're sort of like fungi. So, stick with us and let's learn about protists. Alright, so let's look at our first group, our protozoans. Now remember, these are protists that are animal-like. And remember, the prefix zo, or zoo, is going to mean animal. So when we're talking about protozoans, we're going to divide them up into 4 different phyla according to how they move. Now remember, Protista is the kingdom, and then we can move down to phylum, which is the next category down. So our first category of protozoa is going to be our sarcodines. Now these move with pseudopods, which means false foot. Pseudo means false, pod means foot, and which are just kind of protrusions of the cytoplasm. Our next group are our ciliates, and obviously they're going to move with cilia, again, which are the little hairs on the outside of the cell membrane, and you can see an example in a paramecium. And our next group goes by a few different names. One is mastigophora, or zooflagellates, and these move by flagella, which are kind of the whip-like tails at the end of a cell, and these are going to help the protozoa move. And finally, we have our sporozoa, which do not move. They're boring. Actually, they're not boring at all. Normally, because the sporozoa can't move on their own, they need vectors or other things that can carry them in order to complete their life cycle, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Alright, let's look at our first group a little bit more closely, the sarcodines. Now again, these are the ones that have pseudopods, and a good example of a sarcodine is the amoeba. Now, amoeba is actually a genus, so it's a group of many different species. And amoebas are cool because they can change their shape. They don't have a solid fixed structure, so you can see them kind of moving around, fluidly changing shape, changing where the pseudopod might be. They can have more than one nucleus. But unfortunately, there are certain species of amoeba that can make you very sick as well. Alright, now let's look at some ciliates. So a good example of this, again, is paramecium, and you can see the tiny little hairs on here if you look very closely, and these are going to help the paramecium move around. Now the paramecium is going to ingest things like small bacteria, green algae, other protists, and that is the way it gets food. Now let's look at our mastigophora, or our flagellates. So again, these are going to move around with a whip-like tail structure, and there's lots of mastigophora that actually are going to cause some pretty bad sicknesses, like our sleeping sickness that I showed you at the very beginning. Here's a photo. So the genus Trypanosoma is the protozoan, or the group of protozoans that cause African sleeping sickness. So that's a very bad disease. Giardia lamblia, though, is going to cause really bad diarrhea, and it's contracted from drinking contaminated water. So you can get this even in the United States. You don't have to go to a third world country to get Giardia. It is a nasty, nasty illness. So lastly, we have our sporozoan. Now, they may seem harmless because they can't move far on their own, but what they do is they use vectors, such as insects, to get them where they want to go. So Plasmodium, which is the genus that contains the 4 species of protists that are actually going to cause malaria, and you can see them here in some red blood cells, are going to move around with the help of the mosquito as a vector. And it's a very specific mosquito, the Anopheles mosquito, that will carry this parasite in its saliva and transmit it to you in your blood. So again, just bonus knowledge, there are 4 species of Plasmodium that will give you malaria. There's Plasmodium vivax, Plasmodium ovale, Plasmodium malaria, and Plasmodium falciparum, which is kind of the biggest one in West Africa, where I used to live. Alright, so we've already talked about our protozoans. Now let's talk about algae. Remember, these are photosynthetic, so they're autotrophic. They make their own food. So there are 6 main phyla of these plant-like protists that we're going to look at. Our green algae, our euglena, our dinoflagellates, our diatoms, our red algae, our brown algae. You ready? Let's go. So we have many different forms of our green algae. We think they gave rise to land plants, and they have chloroplasts that contain chlorophyll, as well as cell walls made of cellulose. So they're a lot like the plants we have on land today. Alright, so next we have our euglena. Now, these have both plant and animal-like characteristics, but many have chlorophyll and are photosynthetic. They don't have a cell wall, and they move around. You can see this guy has a nice flagellum here to move around with. Most of them live in fresh water, too. Alright, so our dinoflagellates have 2 flagella that kind of make them spin around, and some can secrete dangerous toxins. But they're generally small, they're unicellular, and they're photosynthetic, and some are even bioluminescent. Now, the pretty phylum are the diatoms. So this is a phylum of algae, and they're noted for really cool symmetry and really beautiful glass shells. So they fit together like a box with a lid. Alright, our next group is called the red algae. So generally they're red, but the colors can vary, and these are marine seaweeds. So they're going to be smaller than brown algae, which we'll talk about in a second, and they can live in deeper waters because the pigment that they use allows them to photosynthesize at greater depths. And if you ever have auger plates that we use in class, it's going to be created from red algae. So you might have run into red algae in some ice cream because there is this carrageenan ingredient that we use in our ice cream. And if you eat sushi, we have nori, which we wrap around sushi, and these are red algae. Red algae is also used in cosmetics, gel capsules, cheeses, lots and lots of uses for red algae. Alright, so next we have our brown algae. These are our seaweeds and kelps. They're going to live in cooler areas of the ocean, and they're all multicellular, so these are going to be really big guys, and they can create this underwater forest habitat. Alright, so that's our algae. Let's move on to our slime molds now. Now remember, these are the ones that are going to be kind of fungus-like. These are the protists that are absorbative, because they obtain food through decomposition of organic material. So these are pictures of slime molds, and they're found on grass. This one is called dog vomit slime mold, because that's what it looks like. But they're pretty funky looking. African sleeping sickness. Look, I have a flagella. Okay, so hopefully you guys were able to gather all that information and fill out your notes pretty well. Now, I want you to go down to the bottom of your notes, and there should be some matching problems for you to do. I want you to fill those out, and we'll check them tomorrow in class. Hope you enjoyed all that information on the protists. I think they're pretty cool. Okay, see you later.